Hello, and thank you for being here. This is a Windows computer, so I will have a bit of a hiccup probably with it, as many of us we will have. My lecture today is about listening, failure, and the unmaking of systems. Also, I'll try to... This reminds me of this very funny meme of Putin that was doing the microphones at some point. Anyway. Hello. So my work begins from the belief that resonance is a way of thinking rather than a simple sonic phenomenon, and a method through which matter, history, and ideology continually reorganize themselves. I use resonance as a lens, both a physical property and a cultural energy. It is through resonance, vibration, and composition that I ask how systems construct themselves, how they fail, and what happens in the space of that failure. To speak about sound here is to speak about relation. Listening in this sense is not a neutral faculty because it receives information, and it is a mode of participation that exposes the procedures through which systems stabilize themselves, recognize themselves, and defend their own authority. When listening encounters the edges of those systems, when it hears something that does not fit, it begins to act. And it interrupts, it becomes political. And failure, then, does not mean collapse, because failure names the moment when a frame can no longer stretch to contain the world acting upon it. Unmaking begins precisely there, not as a destruction, because it is a release, and it's a slow freeing of the world from the categories we used to hold it still. I want to begin with an object that is also a vibration, which is a part of my research since some years. And this one is the bell. The bell once functioned as a communicative system, which was a social body whose vibration organized communal life, and it called labor into rhythm, announced danger, or even storms, accompanied ritual and marked death. And long before telecommunication, the bell was an infrastructure of resonance, a medium that made relation audible. To say that the bell is an event held in metal is also to recognize that it is both an object and event. And the sound was never contained in the bell because it arose in the world that received it. When a museum, for example, vitrines, stores, or archives a bell, and recently I worked with the 15 bells of Märkisches Museum in Berlin, it preserves the metal while suspending the resonance. What remains is a residue of relation, a shell, a ghost, which is caged somewhere, archived to be used for something else. There were also moments when states confiscated bells and melted them into bullets. In that conversion, resonance became a force, and communal vibration entered the logic of command. And the same frequencies that once gathered the village were recast into instruments of power. And listening thus moves from sacred to the geopolitical. Jean-Luc Nancy writes that listening is the moment in which resonance alters the listener, a moment of transformation rather than comprehension. Listening exposes and listening transforms. I will arrive at matter and tuning and meaning. Listening then is not a passive hearing because it is counter-epistemology, which is a way of knowing that resists this visual logic of modernity, which codifies, measures, frames. I begin with matter, because matter is never inert. It holds stresses, micro-vibration, and stored potentials, and it is already becoming. What we call sound is the instant when that becoming crosses into perception. And Gilbert Simondon, which was a French philosopher that deeply influenced Deleuze, and Yu Kuei, which I will arrive later on, described that matter is a prey individual. It is a saturation with potential relations which are not yet stabilized into form. So when I work personally with metal or clay, and my master thesis in sound studies was on applied acoustics, actually constructed 3 bells to understand the proprioception and what it means to create a resonant object. I do not impose the structure because it was impossible. I worked with entropy, the chaos of the material. And I attune to what the matter itself wants to do. If matter is vibration slowed enough to appear still, then listening is how we perceive its internal movement. It is a practice of co-vibrating rather than decoding, and meaning does not pre-exist because within vibration, waiting is to be extracted. And meaning arises only in this encounter, in the relation between a vibrating world and the body that listens. Before the 19th century, for example, imposition of equal temperament, which we all know, tuning systems were relational and situational, which was shaped by seasons, architecture, and ritual, and monks tuned bells not through calculation, but through the embodied listening. And harmony was judged by how a bell resonated with the valley, with prayer, with a human chest. So to describe sound as equal to divinity in those earlier practices was not necessarily an ornament, but it was a recognition that vibration exceeds the framework meant to contain it. An equal temperament flattened this difference because it divided the octave into, as we know, 12 identical steps, and making every key portable, exchangeable, and exportable, which began a tuning system born from industrial reason and colonial expansion. And the universal scale became a sonic infrastructure for empire, enabling music, instruments, and educational systems to circulate globally while erasing local epistemologies. Portability replaced presence, efficiency replaced intimacy. Before that regime, tuning was cosmology. Sound structured calendars and rituals, and it aligned the human with forces beyond the human. And each bell, each tone was a particular relation rather than a universal standard. Tuning then was an ethics of listening, and its disappearance marks the moment when listening became a discipline of control. When listening meets what cannot be resolved, the system fractures, ambiguity becomes method, and opacity becomes right. Equal temperament enabled this global standardization, colonial music education, industrial circulation, and it made every place interchangeable. And standard tuning became capitalism's acoustic dream. A world tuned for circulation instead of relation. And sonic failure proposes this alternative because it begins when systems meet what they cannot contain. And in seismic or infrasonic listening, for example, the signal may never stabilize into tone. Earthquakes produce distortions and pulses that exceed the ear's expectation of harmony, and such events remind us that the world vibrates beyond our thresholds of hearing. Sonification in this context is not a revealing of the hidden truth, because it reconfigures the relation, and listening becomes contingent, which is subject chance. It is affective, and it is uncertain. And as David Dupe writes, this is not listening to sound, but becoming aware of sound, space, and movement in combination. To embrace failure is to resist this technocratic fantasy of total signal capture, the political project that seeks to render every vibration measurable, ownable, profitable. And by accepting the breakdown, we restore opacity, the right of matter and of subjects to remain incomprehensible. And entropy tells us that every act of organization accelerates decay elsewhere. To compose is to sculpt temporary coherence within an economy of collapse. Failure is not a moment that something breaks. It's just the moment that shows its boundary. And this is precisely where David Bohm becomes crucial. And Bohm argues that our deepest crisis, ecological, political, epistemic, arise from a single habit, fragmentation. And thought, he says, breaks the world into pieces that were never meant to be separate and then treats those fragments as independent realities. He calls this the pollution at the source, not something that happened once long ago, but something happening now, continuously. Because for Bohm, the source of fragmentation is always now. Failure then is not error. Failure is the moment when fragmentation becomes audible, when the fracture line in the system reveals itself. Bohm shows us fragmentation as the source of systemic breakdown. And as I mentioned before about Yu Hui, he adds another layer, the idea of organological failure. Hui revisits Hegel and Henri Bergson to argue that civilization progresses only when the spirit can internalize what it externalizes, when it can spiritually metabolize the technical organs it creates. But Bergson, writing during the intensification of the modern war, saw failure of this process. The spirit could no longer keep pace with technological acceleration. It became trapped in the very material extensions it produced, unable to leap beyond them. For Hui, war is the moment when the state cannot integrate its own artificial organs, when mechanism and organism collapse into the same fate, a technocratic system that it can no longer internalize its externalizations. This organological reading is crucial because failure is not only where systems break, failure is where systems reveal their incapacity to integrate what they themselves have created. At the moment of failure, another figure enters, which is the trickster. The trickster appears when structures begin to clot and coherence becomes a cage. Because the trickster's gesture is dismantling, not to destroy, but also to reopen this movement that David Bohm proposed. He describes the world not as a collective of separate things, but as a whole movement, and it is a continuous unfolding in which matter and meaning are inseparable. What we perceive as form, he writes, is only a temporary frozen moment in that flow, a localized slowing of an underlying movement that never stops. And stability, then, it is this illusion born of perception. We carve the world into fragments because we cannot attend to its full simultaneity. But for Bohm, movement is primary. The things we see are secondary. Unmaking aligns with that vision. It does not inject the chaos into an ordered world. It restores what has been overstabilized to the motion from which it came. The trickster, in this sense, is not just the destroyer, because it becomes a conductor, which is guiding form back into movement. The trickster interrupts disclosure, not to undo meaning, but to keep meaning alive, which is a political act of keeping possibility open against the authoritarian will to define. When I speak of the daimon, which would be the liminal space spirit, I name another mode of listening, one that attends to texture instead of truth. The daimon listens where form loosens, where seams becomes audible, and texture is the moment before structure hardens. And to listen as daimon is to practice this permeability, to remain open to what acts upon us rather than to dominate it. Instability becomes a teacher. Unmaking becomes care, but care that always will risk transformation. Simone Weil wrote that attention is a form of prayer, not devotion to an answer, but suspension, a holding open of space where something other than the self may appear. And unmaking performs the same suspension because it refuses to form coherence. It waits with the world. And every system carries an instinct toward the self-preservation, an impulse to stabilize, to fix meaning, to maintain authority, even when doing so requires suppressing what does not fit. To unmake is to accept that what emerges might not resemble what was held before. And from that waiting, unmaking, that refuses to force coherence, it waits with the world a new practice. And I call it, and most of us work in composition, probably we speculated upon it. It's the speculation, speculative composition. And speculation is not guessing because it is staying inside the event while it is still forming. And it took me quite some years to understand what speculative composition actually is. When I compose, for example, with data, I do not ask the sound to deliver information or to stabilize it into meaning because I let it act on me before it becomes intelligible. I work with material that has not decided what it wants to be, seismic or atmospheric data, for example, or these infrasonic murmurs that we cannot even understand. Sonification becomes negotiation. The data becomes a world, and it is a vibratory field that unfolds as I listen to it. And speculative composition, therefore, it's a refusal into expectation that the signal must resolve into a message, because I do not shape the material into this narrative coherence. I allow the material to shape how listening occurs. In speculative listening, the world sets these terms of encounter, not the listener. The sound defines its own temporalities, thresholds, and scales of engagement. Sound ceases to be an object to decode, and I become the one who adjusts to it. Listening becomes the site where knowledge is produced through relation rather than extraction. To speculate, then, is to agree to be altered by what exceeds me. And this is also politics of method because it's a refusal of extraction, of mastery, of epistemic conquest. To listen speculatively is to redistribute this agency between human and non-human, to let matter speak its instability back into the order that seeks to silence it. What follows unmaking is a new fragile architecture, which is a livable, provisional, and it is open to revision. And we call such fragility weakness only because we mistake control for strength. Livability within this complexity is stronger than coherence. That excludes. And listening, failure, and unmaking form a sequence, but is also a cycle, because listening exposes what systems attempt to smooth, and failure reveals their limits. Unmaking frees what has been coerced into legibility, into understanding. I return to where I began, but kind of like the terms have shifted here, because listening has ceased to be reception and has become exposure, and failure has ceased to be collapse and has become mattered, and unmaking has ceased to be destruction and has become care. So to listen is to enter that motion, to stay with it, and to recognize the transformation and not stability is the world's fundamental rhythm. Thank you.